Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Power of Sports, Media and Spectacle in American Culture, by Michael Serazio, narrated by Tait. 1. Keeping the Faith, the Elementary Forms of Sports Life. Ignoring mediated sports today would be like ignoring the role of the church in the Middle Ages, or ignoring the role of art in the Renaissance. Large parts of society are immersed in it, and virtually no aspect of life is untouched by it. Michael Reel, sports scholar. We recognize that sport is the religion of the Western world, so we decided to use the Olympics, the most sacred ceremony of this religion, to make the world pay attention to us. Black September Organization, on its 1972 Munich Games attack. Toward the end of my grandfather's life, we did not, beyond genetics, have a great deal in common. He was 6 decades older and lived 2,500 miles west, on the other side of the country. But I loved him dearly, yearned to connect, and wanted to have something to talk about when I dialed him up every few weeks. So we talked, as many men do, about sports. Specifically, we talked about what, besides family, might have been the last vessel that united us in faith and love: our hometown San Diego Chargers. We harumphed about local sports writers pulling their punches and covering a perennially disappointing franchise, griped about team ownership trying to shake down taxpayers for a sweetheart stadium deal, and lamented the infestation of advertising that was consuming sports media. But we also reminisced fondly. Stories of my grandfather taking my uncles to games at the old Balboa Park field, and my own dim, sweet memories of the 1994 season. Whenever I was back in town, I felt an inexplicable urge to pick up a cap or a shirt with the lightning bolt logo on it. After my grandmother passed, I recall my mother remarking that fall seemed to go faster for Pops because football was in season. It got him through the week and filled the days with something to think about and look forward to. I suspect that, though the details will vary for other teams' fans, the fundamental texture of this ambivalence, economics and culture pulling us in different directions, will feel true and familiar. What mattered most is that my grandfather and I were talking. Period. Nowadays, that is no small accomplishment. In an era of cultural fragmentation, political polarization, and the relentless distraction that comes with living amidst media abundance, sport represents one of the last institutions of unifying mass ritual, bringing together enormous audiences, focused on the present, live moment. In that, it retains a timeless, totemic cultural power long ago revealed to be at the core of religious worship, but given new import in the DVR and smartphone age. Yet, conversely, that power is being strained, co-opted, and artificially manufactured. A variety of media convergence trends are revolutionizing the way that sports are packaged for us. An explosion in opinion-oriented, hot-take journalism formats, branded content commercializing and corrupting new frontiers, and social media accelerating news cycles and displacing traditional gatekeepers. And because, not in spite of its escapist value and its allegedly apolitical sheen, sports can smuggle in powerful but subtle ideological messages about inequality, war, and labor, even as signs of racial activism re-emerge. Simultaneously, the shifting dynamics of gender roles and masculine power, writ large across society, are being reflected in the experiences of female sports journalists, the coverage of violence against the male body, and the ascendance of analytics as a labor ideal. Through in-depth interviews with dozens of high-profile leaders and professionals in sports media and journalism, as well as those in the business and marketing of sports, The Power of Sports explores, maps, and critiques the cultural production of today's lucrative, ubiquitous sports landscape. The book is about how sports explain and reflect life in contemporary American culture, our spiritual experience, technological disruption, commercial greed, economic disparity, military hawkishness, and manhood ideals. If we hold up a mirror to sports, we see the realities of the nation staring back at us, despite what those myths of escapism might like to suggest. At my grandfather's funeral, my cousin brought up to the altar a faded blue Chargers hat that Pops had worn for many years, and it rests today on my aunt's fireplace mantel as a reminder of him. Sport thus helps us endure in every sense of the word, existentially, palliatively, but it does so at an enormous cost, and without naivete among stakeholders about the value and purpose of the spectacle. This book is an attempt to understand that medium, that social glue, its causes and consequences, economic, political, and cultural. Many of these dimensions and issues of sports power have held true for decades, even centuries, but the subject feels newly urgent today, given the transformations both within and beyond. The media evolution, market necessity, and ideological consequence embedded in the games, and the wider societal upheaval, discontent, and contestation that swirls beyond the boundaries of simple play. As former NBA Commissioner David Stern told me, "It's a natural flowing dynamic. You build a building where 18 to 20,000 perfect strangers come together for the communal purpose of rooting the home team on to victory, where people who sometimes don't even know each other are high-fiving a spectacular shot or a winning performance. As life gets more impersonal, as we retreat into our homes and we order our food, we get our EKG, we buy our cars, we do a tremendous amount from the comfort of our smart devices in a chair at home. The last places that people are likely to gather are going to be houses of worship and houses of sports worship. No doubt about it." The box score. The spectacle is, simply put, big time. Perhaps the defining feature of sports culture over the last quarter century has been how it has ballooned in slow motion before our eyes. More interest, more outlets, more money. Ours is an age of sporting excess, right down to the amount of statistical information that now crawls across the ticker updates during TV broadcasts. Depending on which estimate one consults, the global sports industry is pegged somewhere between $200 and $700 billion. Given that this was, by one count, 60% more than the value of the film market, News Corporation overlord Rupert Murdoch not long ago observed, "Sport absolutely overpowers film and everything else in the entertainment genre." Within the United States, nearly a quarter of all Americans spend money at least once a month on sports, contributing to nearly $70 billion worth of tickets, broadcast rights, sponsorships, and apparel. That figure has been projected to grow by another $10 billion over the next half-decade, thanks to a media rights bubble that has yet to burst, and has proven mostly immune to the traditional gravity of financial cycles. The past decade saw 3 straight years of double-digit growth, following a whirlwind of major TV deals. Fans' voracious appetite for sport has pushed it to the center of the pop culture buffet. Just a few years into the new millennium, the explosion of networks and sub-channels dedicated to airing sports content meant that viewers could pig out on some 645 hours per week. Of the 25 highest-rated broadcasts in American television history, 22 have been sporting events, and, on average, sports-related newspaper stories online out-hit all other subjects combined. The intensity of that attentiveness made the NFL into an unparalleled economic juggernaut, and for a time, the most popular and powerful television programming of any kind. By 2016, league games accounted for 60 of the top 100 Nielsen scores, and Super Bowl 48 set a record with 112 million viewers, which was broken only by Super Bowl 49, naturally, which saw 114 million Americans tuning in. And pro football is not alone in this recent dominance. At the peak, in 2015, 93 of the top 100 rated American TV shows in a single season were live sports programs, up from just 14 in the top 100 a decade before. The durability of sports' widespread mainstream popularity, at a time in mediated culture when such blockbuster successes, especially on television, are ever harder to come by, has been a boon to providers pushing the product. ESPN is by far the worldwide leader in cable revenues, pulling in nearly $8 per household in monthly subscriber fees, and representing at one point the principal cash spigot for parent corporation Disney, when it topped out with some $10 billion in earnings. It was called at that time the most valuable media property on the planet. And as former CEO Michael Eisner joked, Disney would not exist without ESPN. The protection of Mickey Mouse is ESPN. Live sport is, simply put, the biggest reason your cable bills have exploded. And fittingly, if you do like sports, chances are decent it's the only reason you haven't cut the cord yet. Beyond ESPN, regional sports networks are also some of the most expensive channels for distributors to maintain in the lineup, and sports programming is said to be keeping the lights on at ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox, accounting for more than 1/3 of all ad sales. Although awash in revenues, sports media are not necessarily awash in profits, an issue vexing ESPN especially. Acquiring all that live content has become more expensive than ever, with sports rights exceeding half of all TV programming costs. This is what's making leagues, teams, and players fantastically wealthy, and American football is, as usual, the apotheosis of such excess. By mid-decade, the NFL was bringing in $13 billion in annual revenue, with Commissioner Roger Goodell ravenously aiming to double that figure within 10 years. Franchise values had already doubled under his tenure, with 20 of the 50 most valuable teams worldwide hailing from the league, including the top-ranked $4 billion Dallas Cowboys. It should be caveated, however, that winning is not necessarily everything when it comes to revenue generation. Rather, as we'll hear shortly, something deeper and more enduring actually churns all that commerce. Coming off a 4-12 campaign, for example, the Cowboys' net worth still grew by 25%, and the similarly woeful New York Knicks, they of the .390 winning percentage, posted their own 20% increase. It's not just the NFL, though, that is finding its boats lifted by this rising tide. Even at the amateur level, the great Orwellian doublespeak of sports labor economics, coffers are flush, with the top 20 college football programs pegged at a collective $3 billion value. Football, as the vast majority of the world knows it, that is, soccer, remains by far the single most lucrative sport, registering some $35 billion in annual revenues, as the rights to England's elite league have skyrocketed 3,000-fold over a half-century. Even baseball, regularly lamented as a fusty cultural relic, seems hardy enough on paper, raking in a record $10 billion in revenues, with more than a third of its teams recently ranking first in primetime home markets. Clearly, then, sport still makes it rain. And sports' apparent immunity from macroeconomic gyrations also makes it a fairly sure thing as an entertainment investment. Not only has there never been a crash in the sports media market, unlike other industries such as tech or housing, it just keeps going up. But even in the midst of the last cataclysmic global downturn, sports' 7% growth rate still exceeded that of almost every nation's GDP. In sum, little seems to have changed since communications professor Robert McChesney declared some 20 years ago that sport was arguably the single most lucrative content area for the global media industry. What is curious, though, is just how much of this commerce seems built upon and stimulated by a fundamental economic, if not cultural, irrationality. This is manifest in the accommodation of swindling cartels, the production of profligate venues, the staging of lavish mega-events, and the thoughtless consumption of branded merchandise. Irrational exuberance. Sports is a way of life, like eating. People say you should pay to feed the homeless, but the world doesn't work that way. So saith Carl Pohlad, late owner of the Minnesota Twins, and a member of the rarefied elite that stands to gain from that spending, encapsulating the way in which the attachment to sports drives all those revenues and grossly disfigures public priorities. That attachment is the reason why in the 1970s, the only paved road in southern Sudan apparently led from the airport to a stadium. That attachment is the reason why of 340 Division I colleges, only 23 athletic departments actually operated in the black. And at Rutgers, a $20 million a year sports deficit was allowed to eat into library costs, faculty hires, and student fees. Owner Art Modell of the Baltimore Ravens, and crusher of dreams in Cleveland, put it even more bluntly than Pohlad. The pride and presence of a professional football team is far more important than 30 libraries. None of this makes sense from a rational standpoint, but the cultural logic of sports, I submit, overwhelms any fidelity to rational judgment. A.J. Maestas, CEO of Navigate Research, a sports marketing agency, explains further. The marketing world for the most part, and the sports marketing world in particular, now has woken up to, it isn't about a rational trade-off with fans with season tickets, or yelling at a television screen because a 23-year-old doesn't go left versus right. It's very irrational. It's very emotional. That means the rules of classic economics don't necessarily apply. I think that the lesson is that people's motivation, especially related to marketing and completely related to sports, is emotional, not economic, cost-benefit, reward incentive, risk-reward. It's just not. It's communal and tribal and emotional. Cities are just as prone collectively to that magical thinking as the individual fans that populate them, and therefore vulnerable to the emotional exploitation leveraged by sports' stakeholders. Nowhere is this more apparent, and appalling, than in the construction of sports venues. Recall that up until the 1950s, most sports facilities were paid for by team ownership. By the 1990s, however, that ratio had flipped, and more than 3/4 of arenas and stadia were being publicly financed. Some $10 billion in municipal largesse was diverted to subsidize venues in the first decade of the 21st century, and 2017 capped an unprecedented 3-year period where $17 billion was spent to create or improve stadia. In just one recent example, the Minnesota Vikings were able to extort from residents half the cost of their $1 billion U.S. Bank Stadium, with its apparently necessary state-of-the-art corporate suites. Why is it so rare that a local government or referendum voters will oppose team demands for new or renovated facilities? On one hand, the basic laws of supply and demand, more cities want franchises than leagues provide, means that those franchises can negotiate from a position of inherent strength, while cities can only and ever play defense against threats to elicit tax credits, property rights, luxury seating renovations, and unsold ticket compensation, among other perks. Those supply and demand conditions are distorted thanks to a monopoly advantage few fellow industries enjoy: Following a 1922 Supreme Court ruling, Major League Baseball, and later other leagues, were granted immunity from antitrust laws, affording these cartels near total control over both the allocation and placement of franchises. One might expect more teams to go around, given Americans' insatiable appetite for sports and steady population growth. And were professional sports a theoretically freer market, there might well be. But with the artificially depressed supply, cities are all the more likely to acquiesce to blackmail for those extravagant subsidies. One expert argues that, because of those factors, big-time sports leagues have established themselves as some of the most powerful firms in the history of America. And as detailed later in this chapter, it is the same monopolistic structure of production that fortifies sport against the forces of consumer fragmentation that have so besieged other pop industries and American culture overall. In other words, without that cartel swindle, the field for forging community might be impossibly spread asunder. Franchises are, moreover, merely mirroring a broader corporate pattern evidenced across industry sectors by extorting public capital and government welfare, with regular threats to pull up stakes and move elsewhere. Indeed, strip mining cities in this fashion becomes even easier if teams don't actually own their own home fields, while those municipalities that are most ripe for abandonment, that is, blighted and cash-strapped, can usually least afford to compete with sexy rival suitors across state lines. In the most infamous instance of infidelity, when Mayflower moving vans squirreled away the Baltimore Colts equipment to Indianapolis under cover of night, it was not for lack of local love. The team had set a regular season attendance record just months earlier. Fans are loyal to their teams, irrationally so, and often to a fault, given the economic realities that so consistently betray them. To be certain, though, it is not only sticks, but carrots as well that drive stadia economics, benefits touted that typically turn out to be more magical than monetary. During the stadia boom of the past few decades, projects were often packaged as urban renewal, an antidote to years of inner-city decay and white flight to the suburbs. Conventional wisdom held that a quirky, charming ballpark complex like that of Camden Yards could spark a downtown renaissance, drawing tourist interest, entertainment venues, and retail chains. Call it the city as theme park planning schemata. And here was yet one more triumph of branding, a way for cities to project, through spectacle, an air of cosmopolitan liveliness in the global competition for capital. Having a big league team somehow symbolizes and communicates the, apparently very necessary image of being a big league city. That shop-worn cliché that mayors and other self-interested boosters, like financiers, developers, and other members of the local business elite, often drop when spinning constituents on multi-million-dollar boondoggles. Yet the research findings are unequivocal. It simply doesn't add up. According to Robert Boddy, a leading scholar of sports economics, stadia and arenas, which often fall prey to higher construction costs and yield lower rent and tax revenues than estimated, make almost no significant impact on cities, providing at best a minor bump to the local economy, or more likely, detract from existing competitors, as all that entertainment spending would simply happen elsewhere in town. Adding insult to injury, teams are now abandoning old, new stadiums at an accelerated pace. The kind of wasteful, planned obsolescence long endemic to consumer goods like iPhones, but seen recently with the Atlanta Braves disposing of Turner Field after just 19 years, and the Texas Rangers finding Globe Life Park inadequate after 22 years. A similarly illogical and fraudulent game of economics also plays out in the hosting of global competitions. Cities will pay a small fortune, typically upward of $100 million, to bid for the privilege of paying a large fortune to host the Olympics, including a $15 billion tab for London, $40 billion for Beijing, and $50 billion for Sochi. Enormous investments are made in facilities that then usually sit unused, the badlands of modernity, as they've been aptly called. And contrary to boosters' claims, tourism actually goes down during these mega events, making profit improbable and financial burden inevitable. Justifications here, too, tend to hinge on the ethereal and ephemeral, with promoters hyping an improved national spirit and mood, and greater social inclusion, qualities that are, by definition, immaterial and incalculable, even as they are accompanied by a multi-billion-dollar price tag. Yet, as I will argue, this collective effervescence is true, real, and necessary, though perhaps not at the foolhardy economic cost it tends to elicit. The identity of a team is a source of unrivaled symbolic power, and therefore also a means of capital manipulation. Given the intimidating emotional hold that teams retain over followers, it becomes harder to formulate a civic identity through other, more productive and public urban emblems. A polis can regrettably imagine itself and its health more easily through a playoff berth than those 30 libraries, to borrow Art Modell's callous comparison. And even if you haven't signed off on an economically wrong-headed stadium deal, you've likely felt the weight of this illogic any time you've ever made a purchase of branded sneakers or other sports-logoed merchandise. This was the real genius of Nike founder Phil Knight. He realized that he wasn't even in the shoe business. He was in the entertainment business. The power and allure of those $100 Air Jordans is wholly imaginary and symbolic, rather than material and functional. Most consumers at the checkout register neither contemplate the bleak conditions of sports merchandise production, nor can they actually, consciously, rationally, believe that in purchasing them, they too can fly like Mike, even as this is precisely the con job that all branding is predicated upon. And because fans worship blindly at this altar of sports myth, myself included, Nike doesn't actually need to make shoes, as its SEC filing reveals, but rather makes meaning. As with other apparel companies in the $170 billion sporting goods industry, its symbolic labor force, for example MJ and Nike's agency of record Wieden and Kennedy, add the real value and reap the cushiest rewards here, not those who are subcontracted to make the actual tangible goods for slave wages, forced overtime, and arbitrary abuse, as Knight himself once acknowledged. We think not of that exploited garment worker in Dhaka when interacting with the swoosh or Chicago Bulls logo that she sewed on, but rather of the seductive wonderment and social power those icons supposedly offer us in the developed, postmodern world. Much the same whitewashing and willful ignorance occasionally accompanies the production of sports facilities, too. When the 2022 World Cup kicks off in Qatar, global attention will no doubt be focused more on the pitch than those migrant worker deaths that went into constructing it. Thus, as should be clear by now, sports are big money. A highly lucrative, multi-branched, transnational economy of enormous scope and influence, and an increasingly central component in the culturization of contemporary economics. And yet, all that commercial exchange appears to be dependent upon a somewhat fuzzy math, one that does not add up when considered in the empirical, verifiable language of cost-benefit for nations, cities, and consumers. It seems like we do not act financially rationally in the presence of sport. But why is that? The sports totem. The answer, and the esoteric essence of fandom, might just be found in a context far removed from sports. Almost precisely a century ago, Emil Durkheim, a pioneering figure of early sociology, pondered along similar lines.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?